Welcome to Dey Weekly. I'm your host, Tim Lyons from Run Through the Jungle. Week episode 14. I'll provide a quick recap from week 14 of the Bengals game. And then for all you fantasy football enthusiasts, I'll also cover the top 5 fantasy point scorers from the week. Now to week 14 versus the Dallas Cowboys. The Cincinnati Bengals secured a 27-20 victory over the Dallas Cowboys on Monday Night Football. Here are some key highlights from the game. Joe Burrow had another impressive performance, throwing for 369 yards and 3 touchdowns. He connected with Jamar Chase for 2 of those touchdowns. Jamar Chase had a standout game, catching 14 passes for 177 yards and 2 touchdowns. His game-winning 40-yard touchdown catch came with just over a minute left in the game. The Cowboys had a chance to take the lead late in the game, but a special teams blunder cost them dearly. They blocked a Bengals punt, but Amani, I'm not even going to try saying his last name. He touched the ball, allowing the Bengals to recover and retain possession. Dwaddle had a strong performance for the Cowboys, rushing for 130 yards on 18 carries. It was a tough loss for the Cowboys, who fell to 5-8 on the season. The Bengals improved to a 5-8 and snapped a 3-game losing streak. Week 15 will be versus the Tennessee Titans in Tennessee. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you want to hear our reactions to the game, catch us right after this. I think we're about 3:45, or it'll be 6:45 your time, I believe. So if you want to hear our reactions to Monday night's game versus the Cowboys, tune in on YouTube, or if you can't catch us live, catch us on all your favorite podcast all your favorite podcast platforms weekly. Also, join us on Wednesday for the Roaring Reaction, the Running Through the Jungle predictions. This Wednesday it'll be Justin and I. Brandon's going to be MIA. He's on PTO, we'll say. And then sometimes we'll do our crossover shows. I know I mentioned this. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Depends if we can find the opponent to do the show with. But you can catch Strange Love and see how they feel about the Bengals and our reactions to it, or our opinions of them as well. Now I'm going to take a quick commercial break, and I'll be right back with you. Welcome back to Dey Weekly. I'm your host, Tim Lyons. Now I'm going to go over the Week 14 fantasy points, football scorers for the week. Also, I jumped the gun last week. I know I said it was playoff time, but no, playoff time is starting this coming week. So if you had a great week this week, you might have made the playoffs, or you might not have made the playoffs. You might have sent some people home, or you might have got sent home, yourself. So we're going to start with the perfect lineup, brought to you by NFL Fantasy Football. Josh Allen for the Buffalo Bills had 51.88 points. Charbonnet for the Seahawks had 38.3 points. Gerendo for the 49ers, I don't recall this guy. Running back for the 49ers had 26.8 points. Jamar Chase had 45.1 points. Puka Nacua had 41.8 points for the Rams. George Kittle had 21.1 points. Addison had 39.3 points for the Vikings. Sanders, the kicker from the Dolphins, had 16 points, and the 49ers had 13 fantasy points for defense. If you had that perfect lineup, you had 230. Oh my goodness, I can't speak today. I'm so sorry. You had 293 fantasy points, and you sent your boys packing. Now to the I'm not so perfect lineup. Will Levis only had 7.02 points. Spears for the Titans only had 3.3 points. Kareem Hunt for Kansas City only had 3.9 points. Reed for Green Bay Packers, 0 points. Tyler Lockett, 0 points for the Seahawks. Cole Kmet for the Chicago Bears had 0 points. Kyle Pitts for the Falcons had 0 points. Santos for the Bears had 1 point. and the Buffalo Bills had negative 4 points. That would give you 11.22 points, and you are probably not going to be playing in this week's playoffs for fantasy football. Sorry, not sorry. Have a good day. Now to the fantasy football point leaders for the week. Now we're going to start off with the quarterbacks. Josh Allen, Buffalo Bills versus the Los Angeles Rams, had 342 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, ran for 82 yards and 3 touchdowns for 51.88 points. Holy cow. Sam Darnold for the Vikings versus Atlanta had 347 yards passing, 5 touchdowns, and 7 yards rushing for 34.58 points. Our own Joe Burrow versus Dallas had 369 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, and an interception for negative 2 yards rushing, and had 24.56 points. Jalen Hurts versus Carolina had 108 yards passing, really? 2 touchdowns, 59 yards rushing and a touchdown for 24.22 points. Tua, I'm just going to leave it at that, versus the New York Jets had 331 passing yards and 2 touchdowns, ran for 3 yards and had a 2-point conversion for 23.54 points. Now to the running backs, the bell cows. At number 1, Zach Charbonnet for the Seahawks versus Arizona had 134 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns, 7 receptions for 59 yards for 38.30 points. And then here's this kid from the San Francisco 49ers, Isaac Gerendo versus Chicago, had 78 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 receptions for 50 yards for 26.80 points. Rashad White versus the Las Vegas Raiders had 90 rushing yards and 1 touchdown. He had 2 receptions for 19 yards and 1 touchdown for 24.90 points. And then at number 4, Josh Jacobs versus Detroit had 66 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns for 24.60 points. And our own Chase Brown versus Dallas, 58 rushing yards, 6 receptions for 65 yards and 1 touchdown for 24.30 points. Now to the wide receivers. Our own Jamar Chase at number 1 versus Dallas, 14 rushing yards. He had 14 receptions for 177 yards and 2 touchdowns for 45.10 points. Puka Nacua at number 2 had 16 rushing yards, and this is versus the Buffalo Bills, and 1 touchdown. He had 12 receptions for 162 yards and 1 touchdown for 41.80 points. Jordan Addison versus Atlanta had 8 receptions, 133 yards, and 3 touchdowns for 39.30 points. Jay Jetta or Justin Jefferson versus Atlanta, 7 receptions, 132 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 32.20 points. Tyreek Cheetah Hill versus the New York Jets, Jets, had 6 rushing yards, had 10 receptions for 115 yards and 1 touchdown for 28.10 points. Now to the tight ends, George Kittle at number 1 versus Chicago, 6 receptions, 151 yards, and 21.10 points. David Njoku versus the Pittsburgh Steelers had 7 receptions for 42 receiving yards and 1 touchdown for 17.20 points. Juwan Johnson versus the New York Giants had 4 receptions for 50 yards and 1 touchdown for 15 points. Trey McBride for Arizona versus Seattle had 7 receptions and 70 yards receiving for 14 points. Pat Freiermuth versus Cleveland had 3 receptions for 48 yards and 1 touchdown for 13.80 points. Now to the kickers, the not football players that are on the field, according to Brandon Harriet, or B Dirt. Number 1, Jason Sanders for Miami versus the New York Jets had 4 field goals made, and 2 of them for 50-plus yards for 16 points. Matthew Wright for Kansas City versus the Chargers, Mr. Doink himself had 1 PAT and 4 field goals, and 1 for 50-plus yards for 15 points. Anders Carlson versus the Miami Dolphins had 2 PATs, had 4 field goals for 14 points. Jason Myers versus Arizona had 3 PATs and 3 field goals for 12 points. And Chris Boswell, of course, he's always on this dang fantasy football points Versus Cleveland, he had 3 PATs and 2 field goals for 11 points. And at defense, San Francisco 49ers defense at number 1 versus Chicago had 7 sacks, a fumble recovery, only allowed 13 points for 13 fantasy points. Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus Las Vegas, 2 sacks, 1 interception, 1 fumble recovery, only allowed 13 points for 10 fantasy points. Pittsburgh Steelers come in at number 3 versus Cleveland, 3 sacks, 2 interceptions, a fumble recovery for allowed 14 points and had 10 fantasy football points. Jacksonville at number 4 versus Tennessee, they had 2 sacks, allowed 6 points, and got 9 fantasy points. The Las Vegas Raiders versus Tampa Bay, 4 sacks, 2 interceptions, 1 fumble recovery, allowed 28 points, and had 9 points. Now that wraps up the Dey Weekly. Thank you guys so much for watching and listening. Have a great week, and Dey.